Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Gears of War 3 for Xbox 360. This is a cover-based third-person shooter by Epic Games and published by Microsoft that was released in September of 2011 exclusively for Xbox 360. It is of course the sequel to Gears of War 2, and like its predecessor was a bestseller for the console. It sold ridiculous amounts of copies, it got a ridiculous amount of critical acclaim, that sort of thing. But the real question here is not so much about the hype and the critical acclaim it received upon release, it's how this thing actually stands as a game. Is it better than Gears of War 2? Does it improve upon the things that Gears of War 2 did really poorly and ultimately drag that game down quite a bit? And does it take what Gears of War 2 actually did fairly well and improve upon it? Let's find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, it's definitely quite a big step up over Gears of War 2 in that the textures are a lot sharper and cleaner, they're higher res, it seems. The actual environments are a bit more detailed. There's actually more color in this than the previous games, although not much. It's basically, in addition to the brown and gray and not much else, they have added bright glowing yellow in droves, and they've added some green on occasion. That's pretty much it. But hey, it's better than just brown and gray and mostly gray. There is, however, a lot of reuse of various assets, things like the models and the animations and such like that, which is fine because they did update some of the details on those things, but they are starting to show their age. And then there's the other problem this game has, where the frame rate is not exactly consistent. Now, this only really pops up during cutscenes, where it's loading a few things in while it's playing these cutscenes, and you're going to see a lot of frame rate hitching during those cutscenes. It's actually really irritating. And I did notice that the lip syncing and such does not always exactly match up with the things that they're saying. So that kind of thing is annoying, but it's not deal breaking. It is something you do have to keep in mind, however. When the game is actually being played, it's mostly a smooth frame rate. I didn't really see any major drops or anything like that. But it is pretty jarring when you go from pretty smooth gameplay all of a sudden to a really janky cutscene. So that is something you need to keep in mind when you go into this thing. Now, as far as the sound design goes, it's pretty much the same as it's always been, which means that it's on the upper tier of pretty solid. Most of the sound effects are very fitting. The weapon effects can be pretty beefy on occasion, particularly with the shotguns, for example, as well as explosions and things like that. But then there's the voice acting, which generally does a pretty good job with what they've got, although their script really isn't all that great. There is a lot more joking around in this game than there was in the previous games, which is kind of weird if you're used to the Gears of War games, which have kind of beat you over the head with, "We are very serious." And then you hit this one, and it's still trying to do the serious thing while also making a lot of these various character quips, where, for example, Sam and Baird make fun of each other all the time. And while it is nice to see characters doing things other than brooding and being serious all the time, it just seems at odds with itself. And then there's the music, which is pretty much the same as it's always been. I mean, it's still decent music, but it just doesn't feel like it fits, because this is a ridiculous game, and the music is not really supporting how ridiculous it really is, and is instead trying to be taken a bit seriously. So while it is good music, it just feels tonally inconsistent with what's going on in the game. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is you are once again Marcus Fenix, and this takes place about 2 years after the events of Gears of War 2, where humanity is now spread to the winds and is trying to eke together a meager existence in the ruins of what was once their society. And now it's hit the point where the COG don't really have a stronghold of their own. So Marcus and Delta Squad are on a ship that is basically their base of operations now, and they're effectively living as stranded people who just kind of scavenge what they can in order to survive. And it's in this environment that Chairman Prescott comes back, and he hands Marcus a disc that is from his father, which is kind of weird considering that his father was supposedly dead. Obviously what that means is that his death was faked, and he went off to a secluded place to continue research on emulsion and find a way to stop it from destroying the planet, which is what it has basically been doing this entire time. And of course, the ship does get attacked by the Lambent, which are locusts that are infected with emulsion. And so you have to fight them off, and eventually it leads to you trying to track down Marcus's father. and find a way to stop the Lambent once and for all. Along the way, you will run into some Stranded, you will run into the Locust, or what's left of them after the events of Gears of War 2, and you'll ultimately bring a conclusion to the Marcus Fenix story by attempting to stop the Emulsion, as well as attempting to eradicate the Locust once and for all. And like all the other Gears of War games, it's not a very good story at all. It's really little more than a series of set pieces that are tied together by a very weak overall narrative, and what you ultimately end up with is a testosterone-fueled campaign where it's constantly trying to shove these ridiculous, over-the-top set pieces down your throat and go, "Isn't this awesome?" Except that it doesn't really work all that well most of the time, and it's just kind of a whatever sort of affair. And ultimately that's the biggest problem with the campaign, is that it has this really nasty sense of been there, done that. Now, luckily for the campaign, it is paced a hell of a lot better than Gears of War 2 was, where Gears of War 2 would have several hour-long stretches of you just running around doing cover-based shooting and nothing else. This one, on the other hand, has a lot to try to break up the monotony by making sure you are thrown into turrets or into mech suits called silverbacks, or any number of things like that, where it really does shake up the monotony by allowing you to, instead of just constantly sitting there behind cover, occasionally poking out to shoot at things, actually giving you the chance to just mow down everything in your path for a change. So at least it doesn't feel like quite as much of a drag as the previous two games, where they just dragged on and on and on. This is still a fairly long game for a third-person cover-based shooter, but it doesn't feel quite as long as its predecessors simply because it is paced better. And that's a good thing too, because it still suffers from a lot of the same problems that the previous Gears of War games had. Firstly, the constant trying to shove emotions in your face in a testosterone-fueled third-person shooter where all of the men have ridiculously thick necks and ridiculously thick arms. They are muscle-bound beyond belief. They're manly men who growl all the time and scream angrily at things. They cuss all the time. There's tons of blood and gore. There's chainsaw bayonets and all sorts of things like that. And then it expects us to take things like this seriously.
Baby, I'm sorry I couldn't bring you home. But you're with the kids now. That's home, yeah?
You would have thought they would have learned their lesson by now about trying to make something like this serious, even though the game is completely and utterly ridiculous. But nope, they haven't, and it does definitely drag the single player down as a result. But at least those moments are relatively short, so you can just kind of turn your brain off for a moment while it tries to shove emotions in there and just fails miserably at it. Anyway, the gameplay itself is what you've come to expect from Gears of War at this point, only it has been tweaked and polished to a higher degree than it was in Gears of War 2. This one feels a hell of a lot smoother simply because they improved the aim sensitivity. So now you can actually kind of aim at things with a slight degree of speed. Certainly not as much as other console games out there, and certainly nowhere near as much as a PC, but it's definitely better than it used to be, so they did make noticeable improvements in that regard. Unfortunately, the cover system and the roadie run still have problems where you try to get behind cover, but it doesn't always work properly, and the roadie run just kind of locks you into moving forward and not much else. You can barely turn with that, so if you try to do any sort of sharp turning, you'll need to stop entirely and then turn with the look stick, and then resume doing your roadie run, at least until you manage to hit another point where you need to do a sharp turn again. It's still mildly annoying and feels like you don't really have a full degree of control over your character, but it's better than it used to be. And that's kind of the point with the single player, at least overall. It's better than it used to be, but that's really not saying all that much. The previous two Gears of War games didn't really have very good single player campaigns to begin with. The enemies were really bullet spongy, the gameplay itself was very tedious, very static, where you just kind of duck behind cover, and then occasionally pop out to shoot at things. They do try to spice things up a bit more by giving you a retro Lancer, which is the old version of the Lancer that does not have a chainsaw bayonet, but still has an actual bayonet on it. And if you try to do the melee attack with that, instead of just doing the rev up the chainsaw and then saw them to bits thing. You actually engage a sort of charge mode where when you slam into an enemy, most of the time it's going to instantly kill them and you'll go through an execution animation. And that's certainly appreciated to try to break up the cover-based paradigm, but ultimately it still is a very static game. You're still going to be ducking behind cover most of the time and just kind of sitting there, occasionally peeking out to shoot at things and then going back into cover. It gets pretty tiresome as you continue through the main campaign, which is fairly long. I believe it's around 9 or so hours long, depending on your difficulty and depending on how decent you are at the game. And even though it's better than it used to be, it still does drag in places, and part of that is due to how static the combat is. Cover-based shooters are already at a disadvantage because of that, and Gears of War certainly suffers from this problem no matter what you do to it, basically. At least in terms of the single player. When you go to the multiplayer side of things, you've got pretty much the exact same kind of thing you saw in Gears of War 2, just with, again, some slight tweaks and polishes. They changed up some of the game modes, so now you have Capture the Leader, which is kind of a combination of Guardian and Submission modes, where you try to down the enemy team's leader and then hold on to them for as long as you can in order to score more points, but ultimately is not particularly new. And then there's the addition of the straight-up team deathmatch mode, which is exactly what you would expect. It's just a straight-up team deathmatch mode. Believe it or not, the series did not have a normal TDM mode until this game, which is kind of odd. Until then, it was just the Warzone mode, which does make its return, where it's a round-based mode where you try to eliminate the enemy team, and every time you eliminate the enemy's team, you gain a point, and whoever gets the most points out of the point limit wins the overall match. Team Deathmatch is just best of 2 rounds, basically, and you try to get the most kills. Pretty straightforward stuff. And then there's the new Beast mode, which is in addition to Horde mode. Now, where the normal Horde mode has you fighting against the Locust Horde as COG soldiers, Beast mode is basically the inverse of that, where you're fighting as the Locusts against the COG. And as you go through the match, you will get money that you can use to buy new classes of Locusts. So you can get, for example, a Boomer. And it's kind of an interesting spin on the Horde mode, but otherwise is pretty much exactly the same. Only it's a lot shorter, and it's you as the Locust versus the COG. So even though it's kind of a neat mode, again, it's not really anything truly new. It's just slightly different than what we had before. And that's part of the problem with Gears of War 3 in general. It's just more of the same with some slight tweaks here and there. And if you're like me and you didn't really care for Gears of War 1 or 2 to begin with, you're not really going to care much for Gears of War 3 either. Sure, it's the most polished of the 3. Sure, it is the best of the 3. But that's not really saying all that much. The Gears of War series was never anything really to write home about to begin with. It has its place in gaming history as the game that popularized the cover-based shooting mechanic, but when it comes down to it, Gears of War 3 is not a particularly good game. It's not particularly bad either, and that's part of its problem. It's just somewhere in the middle. And ultimately what's going to make or break it for you is either if you enjoyed the previous Gears of War games, or if you like cover-based shooters. If those don't apply to you, then you're probably not going to be able to get anything out of Gears of War 3. But it's not an outright bad game. It's the kind of thing that I can really only recommend if you can pick it up for relatively cheap. And considering how cheap it is these days, usually somewhere in the $3 to $5 mark, you could certainly do a hell of a lot worse than this. But again, if you're like me and you don't particularly like Gears of War 1 or 2 to begin with, you're not really going to be able to get all that much out of Gears of War 3. And even worse, I don't really see where this thing can progress going forward if it stays with this formula. It's pretty much exhausted itself by Gears of War 3. Yes, they added in a few new things, but it really just ended up being more of an advancement and a slight tweak of what was already there than actually innovating and bringing in new things. It just polished things up. And yes, the series did need that, but ultimately it needs more than that if it's going to survive from here on out. And I guess we'll have to wait and see where things go from here. I haven't picked up Gears of War Judgment yet, so I'm not going to review that until later on down the line, but I don't really see where it could improve all that much on Gears of War 3, with this formula being as tired as it is already. I give Gears of War 3 a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.